And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a stronger front pushing eastward here with small craft advisory winds mostly here into the central Aleutian areas, and another weaker system bringing rain here, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay up into southern Cook Inlet. Other than that, a pretty quiet night coming up for much interior Alaska all the way down the southeast coast. And quiet conditions continue into tomorrow as well here over the interior. Maybe a little bit of flurry conditions on the eastern Arctic coast. Chance of rain here over the southern part of the state from actually Prince William Sound out to Bristol Bay, but sunshine for the Panhandle and most of the interior. Weakening front spread some rain eastward toward the Fox Islands with wet conditions all the way back to the main low center. And then on Friday, that low center tracks eastward here. Front makes a pretty good jog to the northeast, linking up with that leftover moisture and increasing southeast flow. So chances of rain increase here for south central Alaska, especially Prince William Sound, Kamishak Bay, west for Kodiak Island, all the way down to the Alaska Peninsula, northward along the Yukon Delta coast. Dry in the north there and sunshine. Nice conditions, highs well into the 60s for the southeast coast with light winds. Marine forecasts, east to southeast winds, 10 to 15 knots for the south coast. Otherwise, the central coast here, easterlies 10 to 20 knots. And the north coast, east winds 15 to 25 knots. Light variable winds for Lynn Canal tomorrow, north at 10 for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait. Outlook for Friday, east winds 20 knots here for the south coast, north coast, east-northeast winds 20 knots. Seas running 6 to 7 feet. Lynn Canal, north winds at 15 knots, northeast at 10 for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, southeast wind at 10 knots. Prince William Sound, east winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots, seas as high as 10 feet. Gale warnings out for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, east winds sustained at 35 knots with seas 10 to 11 feet. Small craft advisory still in the forecast for Cook Inlet for northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And then for Friday, winds stay northeast for Cook Inlet but fall back to about 15 to 20 knots. And small craft advisories here for the western North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, east winds 25 knots there with 7 to 8 foot seas. Northeast wind 15 knots, seas 3 feet for Prince William Sound. Southeast winds 20 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. And for Kodiak Island on Thursday, east winds 20 to 25 knots, seas up to 8 feet. Light variable winds for the Alaska Peninsula at 10 knots, variable to east winds at 10 knots for Bristol Bay. And then for Friday, southeast to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. East winds at 20 knots for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, east at 20 in Shelikof Strait, east side of the island there, south at 15. Western Aleutians, tomorrow we've got anywhere from southwest to southeast winds to east winds at 30 to 35 knots. Adak and Atka, southeast at 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, variable to southeast winds at 20 to 25 knots. Then for Friday, eastern Aleutians, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. West at 30 knots for Adak and Atka. Western Aleutians, west and northwest winds at 30 knots with seas running anywhere from 11 to 19 feet. And for the southwest coast on Thursday as well, St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds 15 knots, Norton Sound, northeast at 20, northeast winds 20 knots also for St. Matthew Island, east at 20 knots for the Pribilofs. And then for Friday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds 20 knots, east of 15 for the Yukon Delta coast. South of Nunivak Island, looking at east winds here at 20 knots. Gale warnings though, St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 35 knots, seas 10 feet, southeast at 25 with 6 foot seas for the Pribilof Islands. For the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, brisk wind advisories, northeast winds 25 knots. Northeast at 15 for the western Arctic coast, central coast there at 10 knots from the northeast. Light variable winds for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And for Friday, northeast at 15 there for the eastern coastline, and northeast at 10 for the central coast. Pick it up to 20 knots there for the western Arctic coast from the northeast. And the Chukchi Sea, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots.